Good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome you to the first roundtable of this year's PHAIDRAcon. With me, I have three great guests, and I like them to introduce them by themselves. And I like to start with Fanny Gagova.
Yes, so thank you so much for inviting me to partake in this roundtable, and I'm really excited to talk with the other guests about the topic today. So my name is Fanny Gargova. I'm from the Goethe University, Frankfurt, and I am a postdoc researcher at a project which deals with creating a corpus of all synagogues that existed in 1930 on the territory of Hesse. And it's a commemorative project, but also the idea is to collect data to really make it accessible in terms of archival material, in terms of images and so on. So this is something which is happening right now, but I've also had the experience in Vienna actually to work at a project which was trying to create a digital archive of Byzantine art and architecture. So I have had a lot of experience with collecting data, especially from the art and architectural history side, and dealing with what it means to be able to make it accessible, and also on what kind of metadata it needs to be able to be usable for future research.
Thank you. Next, I will like to ask Devin Donaldson.
Good morning. My name is Devin Ray Donaldson. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Information and Library Science in the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at Indiana University, Bloomington in the United States. I am director of the Master of Library Science program here, and also direct the specializations in archives and records management and digital curation. I study issues related to digital repositories, scientific data reuse, and issues of security and trust. And I think I was invited to be on this panel because one of my research projects is looking at the needs of scientists across multiple disciplines and how they articulate what they want from digital repositories in service to their data management plans. And so it's appropriate to be on a panel where very similar issues are being raised. And so I look forward to contributing to this roundtable.
Thank you, Devin. And then I'd like to welcome Neil Jeffries.
Hello, I'm Neil Jeffries. I'm Head of Innovation in the Department of Open Scholarship Support at the Bodleian Libraries at the University of Oxford. I've been involved with interoperability and library technology for a long time, and I'm also some of the time a researcher in the digital humanities. I think in the context of this talk, I've been involved with the creation of the International Image Interoperability Framework, also the Oxford Common File Layout for storing version digital objects, and the SWORD protocol for moving digital objects between repositories. I've also been involved with the development of both the Fedora repository platform and the Invenio RDM repository platform. So I have quite a wide experience. I teach, or have been teaching, as part of our Masters in Digital Scholarship, a course on using IIIF for research. So I have quite a lot of contact with active researchers and what their requirements are for resources that we put online in the library.
Thank you, Neil. And I'm the host. I'm Raman Ganguly from the University of Vienna, hosting the PHAIDRAcon, and I'm responsible there for the developing and operating the repository for data management. And for this, it brings me to the first question. So, because we all work close with researchers or are already researchers here in this panel, and from this perspective, it's always interesting what the researchers themselves requires from data standard. So maybe Devin, you can tell a little bit from your research topic about this, because you have I think you have a lot of insights from this.
Yeah, so I've recently conducted a study where I conducted some focus groups with researchers from atmospheric and earth science, from ecology, from computer science, from neuroscience, and from chemistry. And I found in these discussions that scientists were really concerned with data searchability and data discoverability. And it could be, and so I think when we think about what they want, then that's an appropriate place to then think about what standards would need to be in place to accomplish that. So if you want data searchability and you want data discoverability, what data standards and what metadata standards can help support data searchability and data discoverability? So they might not use the terms that we use to articulate what is needed from data standards, but it's very apparent to me that if they're talking about things that would suggest they're interested in data searchability, and if they're talking about things that would suggest that they're interested in data discoverability, then what they're wanting then is metadata standards and data standards that could enable that. So they might not use the terminology that we use, but it's what they want. And so that's what I found across multiple focus groups, was just this idea of, well, I'd like to search across a variable. If I'm interested in what happens when this metal is heated at this particular temperature, who's done studies that, could give some insight to that? So is there a repository system that could search across multiple data sets for this variable of interest? All right, so then for us or people that are managing these systems, then I think that's a request to us about how we can enable that and what data and metadata standards would support that.
Thank you, Devin. I think the findability of data are very essential, because if you don't know which kind of data are out there, then it's not easy, or it's not possible to reuse them. And so I like to go with this question to Fanny. So especially also from that what Devin have experienced, definability and the metadata standards.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, it's really interesting because I'm coming from the humanities perspective, right? So we're kind of like the people that you've talked to are coming from an area where I feel like there is already an awareness of what data is. Let's start with that. And in the humanities, I think there is still this different kind of understanding of data is something that needs to come to me somehow, or it's information. It's not data. It's not structured. So to answer the question in a very simple way, I think researchers in the humanities, or my experience with this, is that it needs to be easy. It needs to be easily found, as you said, the findability and discoverability. But what that means is that the standard, well, we are the ones, the researchers are also the ones that are creating the data and creating the metadata. And therefore, this easiness of creating the data and finding the data is something which is related to a lot of translation, actually, translation from a linear kind of text-based research approach to structured data to structured information. And I think this is something which this translation from one to the other is what is really somehow needed at this in this point, because the easiness of creating data and metadata and finding data and metadata is dependent on how well structured it is and how well it is made available. So I believe that we are at a place where there is already an awareness of all of this, but still it's about pretty much teaching and training people to, as Devin, you said, to actually also use the lingo and the correct lingo, and therefore to understand what is involved in creating data, metadata.
We had discussed the definability and the metadata and also the structuring of data. I think that brings us also a bit to the perspective of repository. So in which ways can help then repositories also to structure the data, and which kind of standards we can use for them and to help this findability issue, Neil?
I think in my experience, there is an issue of probably too many metadata standards at the moment and too much specialism in the metadata standards, which really hinders discoverability because it narrows the reach of discovery tools quite significantly. So people tend to search only within their domains, and the domains are very narrowly specified. And that really limits the capacity for any level of interdisciplinarity or any interchange of information in a broader level. So there is actually a lot of utility in some of the more generic standards. I mean, DataCite sits up the top, but that is very, very basic. But I think there is scope certainly for a simplification of the standards to improve discoverability in terms of breadth. Where I do see a lot of importance in discoverability is acknowledging the fact that Google and the regular search engines are actually very powerful tools which are still used by a lot of academics. And therefore, whatever metadata you have, if you can map it to things like schema.org and more generic web-friendly schemas and make it available that way, then you actually improve the overall discoverability of those items. I think another important aspect of that is, whilst making the things discoverable, actually allowing them to, once they've been found, be retrieved by machines using API calls rather than relying always on human intervention to actually get hold of the data is another significant step. And I think in the past, probably 4 to 5 years, I've seen sort of a massive increase in the number of machine tools and mechanisms for trawling databases, for extracting useful data, and their machine readability is essential.
Thank you. I think that's a crucial aspect of also discovering is the machine actionability. So to discover all the things what's out, it's necessary that also we have these APIs, and that not only human can interact with the repository, so with the data archives. What do you see, Fanny, from the perspective of the humanities with this very technical approach, and so reflecting to your discipline?
Yes, thank you. I fully agree that it's so important to be able to make it interoperable, the data, in all different ways. And I believe that especially in the humanities, where we are so dependent on multilingualism, not only interdisciplinarity, but there are so many languages involved. It's not everything in English. You know, you have German, you have French, whatever. Is controlled vocabulary. We are very much dependent on controlled vocabulary, and it's important to be able to included in any kind of repository, any kind of metadata standard that you are using, so as to be able to make it accessible and findable, and actually also machine readable. In many ways, just to give you an example, a building can have so many different names in many different eras, in many different languages, and therefore to be able to know we're talking about the same thing, and so also for the machine to know we're talking about the same thing, controls vocabulary is key. And there, what I believe is important is to make it accessible for the researchers to actually also contribute to controlled vocabulary, so as to have it more centralized, or as Neil said, to make it, to not have so many different kind of standards, not so many different kind of disparate different ways of accessing the material, but really to be able to centralize it, or at least to be able to, for the different machines and different databases, to talk to each other. So I believe this is a very crucial point in the humanities.
Devin, from your experience, the controlled vocabularies now reflecting to other disciplines, is that also very essential?
One of the things that I thought was interesting that came up in my study was how some people wanted automated metadata creation when uploading their data into repositories to save time and provide at least some level of description of their data. So whether that's feasible or appropriate, we can talk about that differently. But that was, as I'm thinking about this roundtable, I'm thinking about things that might be a little bit different from what we would have expected, or what perhaps I would have expected based on reading previous research in this area. But I think there's a tension, because at one level, like, the data creator is very much aware of the circumstances of the creation of the data, and so they're best positioned to be able to provide metadata for it. But then it's the time that it takes, or the perception of the time that it takes, to provide metadata and provide good metadata. And humans might only be able to provide some of that contextual information, but yet there is this desire, or wish list, and I don't know how achievable it may be, but they want the metadata creation to be automated, because then it's one less thing that they have to do. And I think there is some metadata that is amenable to being automated, but probably some others that are not, unless, without humans, because they are aware of the context, and are able to provide those details. So I know that doesn't exactly answer your question, but it is definitely something that came out in the focus groups. And I mean, there is definitely some data that we have, some metadata that we have the capacity to automate, but it's a want, whether, it's achievable or appropriate.
So that's very interesting, the whole automation. And I think that's really one point, because providing good metadata is time consuming. And there's always a question of how can these be automated? Neil, from your experience, do you have some experience with automation of metadata or control vocabularies?
I would say in some respects, but I think this is very much a work in progress. And I think this touches on, I guess, something else that's happening in the repository world, which is the increase in the use of persistent identifiers for different bits and pieces. Certainly within the sciences, for the automatic creation of metadata, and to some extent within humanities, you can start to look at, once you have persistent identifiers for facilities, for instruments, for research projects, you can actually start to mine those resources for metadata if they're included with the data sets that are produced. So you can mine existing sources of metadata, transfer it to the data set, because it's a transitive operation. Within the humanities, Equally, this is also a developing area, is looking at creating resources around people and place as the sort of key anchors for contextualizing. Devon brought up the word context, and I think that's very important. A lot of these data sets in the humanities especially, but also in the sciences, don't make any sense unless you've got an awful lot of that contextual information. And I think we're now at the stage of trying to build those frameworks. A lot of that's framed in terms of persistent identifiers. And a lot of that is stuff that isn't stored or isn't necessarily accessible directly next to the object that's in the repository. You're relying on other repositories, guarantees, or indices to provide that. And that shifts your data set or shifts your research output or your data set into being a node in a broader knowledge graph. And what you're actually interested in is, if you're interested in meaning, is actually capturing all of that knowledge graph. And that's not something you do alone as a repository. It's part of a community process, capturing all of that information. And that makes it a more complex process, but also a more collaborative process.
And Ramon, now I'm thinking more about the original question that you asked me, and none of my participants spoke of controlled vocabulary, but they spoke of like wanting help with metadata and wanting help with using metadata standards. And I think maybe part of the reason they were saying that was because they didn't necessarily feel comfortable with the controlled vocabulary that needed to be used in service to the metadata standards, or you know, there's a learning curve, and sometimes it's more steep depending on which metadata standard that you're working with. So I think probably underlying an articulation of wanting help with metadata standards is feeling not as well versed with some of the control vocabulary, or not as well versed with how to harness the power of some of the metadata standards, but also recognizing that if they did, that would be better for their data and would be better they could more effectively contribute to data repositories and more effectively use them.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a potential, just simplifying factor. There's a lot of researchers, the term controlled vocabulary really is something that exists within libraries and a few other places and isn't in general use in the research lexicon, as it were. And in that case, once you've explained it to them, they may understand what you actually mean. And well, that's obviously the metadata we need to put about that. So I think there's probably an element of that being there. I think the other thing we are seeing, or certainly in the humanities research I'm involved with, is looking at automated generation of metadata, where you're starting to use text analytical techniques to go through a text, and you will do things like named entity extraction. So you look for persons, for place names, for dates. We've done a similar thing where you're looking through a taxonomic database and actually picking out the names of the Latin names of organisms. And you can do the same thing with chemistry papers and extract the names of the chemicals. They are very formulaic and standardized. So you can actually, you're starting to see the automated generation of metadata through the use of text mining. And in a way, it's also a research technique. And sometimes you're mining historical stuff where you're looking for things like term extraction or topic analysis to work out what's going on. So again, that's something that's arriving down the line. And it's techniques, I think, that are used quite a lot in the humanities at the moment, but actually could have much wider application.
And, some of the things that I've already discussed that my participants had mentioned, I know that repositories are already working on this, and some more so than others, but it may be that whatever repositories that my participants have had experience with, they are not as far along with some of this, or maybe they already are doing it. They just don't know or understand that that's happening in the context of some of the repositories that they've interacted with. So, in any case, it's interesting to hear what researchers' needs are and what they think is going on or what they think is not going on, because it might very well be that repositories are already doing what they want. They just don't recognize it or can't see it or don't quite understand that that's what's going on. And, then there's an opportunity, for education and for deeper understanding.
Yeah, thank you. That was quite interesting. Also, the automatism, how it can work, and also that's a lot of education also necessary to bring researcher to this topic. So, Fanny, from your perspective, do you have some experience in your field with automatism and to generate automatically metadata or controlled vocabulary?
Right. So the question of automatic metadata creation is one which is obviously always there. I mean, I think this is the biggest misunderstanding of data metadata. And this is what frustrates, I think, a lot of researchers, because they think, well, okay, I'm giving you all of this. Why don't you just extract the metadata and I can go on with my life and with my research and do everything that is important, right? The analysis. And don't have to bother with all of the tedious and very time-consuming effort of creating metadata. So in many ways, the experience is my experience with automatic creation of metadata comes from that side, from actually having to always talk to people and tell them, well, it's not as easy. And actually, even if you already have the metadata, you have to clean it up. Maybe you have to go through Open Refine, whatever. It takes time. You have to map it. But one thing that works perfectly in my field, in the art and architecture field, is place, which is something, if you have images, for example, with a the data in the EXIF, which tells you exactly where the picture was taken. This is something which obviously can be taken out of it automatically and can be ingested, and therefore create already a very stable point of reference, the geographical point of reference. And based on this and on the geocodes, obviously the database could, for example, look for references in authority files which exist on especially in when it comes to the classical world, and so on and so on. So this works to a certain extent, but I believe that what is really misunderstood, as you said, is that there is no need for the human to do additional just to control what's going on, or to clean it up and so on. And I think this is one part where it really needs well, if not education, at least a discussion between the fields and with researchers to make it apparent that, well, okay, we can get there. As Neil, you said, there is a lot already that has been going on, like searching for certain terms or themes, but it just takes time and it takes a lot of effort to get there. So yeah.
Thank you, Fanny. So we have left a little bit the topic of the standards and going now to make it more automatic. But I think these both are very related, because you cannot do automation without any standards. And we are also now we also have discussed the role of the identifier. And also there is the question of standards of identifier, and how to build really this idea of the context and moving repositories together, that you have a very big or very rich knowledge graphs. So Neil, what do you see from this perspective of connecting the data and the standards to where we are there around?
Hang on, I've just unmuted.
Okay.
I mean, the way I see it, really, research data kind of sits at the meeting point of what I would call three different knowledge graphs, which are sort of fragments of the wider World Wide Web knowledge graphs, or subsets or specialisms of it. You've kind of got the library knowledge graph, so library cataloging standards, classifications, archival standards, which already exist and are quite well established, even if they need a little bit of mapping and explanation to actually map to what researchers would expect to read. Then you've got I guess, the scholarly knowledge graph, which is actually trying to put in the discipline specific pieces of information. So you'd have sort of sitting at the junction with the library knowledge graph, you've got things like name authorities and place authorities, which are partially populated by scholars and partially by librarians. But also you've got various subject specific ontology sitting in there. And you've got the links to things like subject specific resources, so research facilities and things like that in the sciences, various databases in the humanities and social sciences. And then you've got the research information knowledge graph, so things like the open air graph, which is interested in funders and projects and organizations. And all of those actually are bits of metadata that are useful to contextualize your data. And each of those is pursuing, to some extent, its own standards track. So a lot of persistent identifiers where activity is going on tend to be around the research information side. So identifying funders and projects and researchers in the form of ORCIDs. And those can be very useful because once you've got the idea of a research project, you can start to attach a lot of bits and pieces to that, and that will carry through to any data that the project generates, any papers that that project generates. So that's a useful identifier and a carrier for that information. And in the UK, we're looking at something called RAID, Research Activity Identifier, which started in Australia and is being picked up around various places. But that's part of a different mix of bits and pieces. Where there isn't, I think, a lot of clarity is in the sort of scholarly area, where pretty much everything that's not a publication is, at the moment, as far as I can tell, getting a DataCite DOI. And that is probably overly general. I know I expressed a desire to have, more general standards in terms of metadata and discovery, but DataCite DOIs are probably a bit lacking specificity at the moment. And maybe that's an area for further work.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. So from the moving also a little bit back to the researcher perspective. So when it comes to knowledge graphs and from the active research question, which kind of knowledge graph do you think it's necessary or should be designed, Fanny?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't completely understand. I hope I understood it correctly.
So Neil addressed that we have different kind of information systems and knowledge graphs now. And when it comes now to the perspective of a researcher, so you want to use the data, you want to discover the data. What kind of knowledge graphs would help you for your work, for your discovering of data?
Right. So I think, well, with everything that Neil just said, I think in many ways, I just realized that one of the most important knowledge graph is to a certain extent is the last one, because in the end it's all about funding, right? Because none of our research, we can do nothing without the funding, and we have to actually act. We have to understand that we ourselves, as the person, as the researcher, is also a source of data, or could be data in the sense of having an ORCID ID and really displaying it. through data. And so this is one thing which I believe is still very much hasn't really been taken into consideration. This is one part. It has nothing to do with the research per se, with the content of the research, but it is a very crucial part in getting there. And I think it's as soon as we start understanding this, that it is also about how we are participating in the data, the more we will get out of it. So this is just one part which I believe is important, but pretty much it's exactly as I said before. I think authority files belong to controlled vocabulary. So authority having those instances of clear points of references is what really is crucial, because otherwise I believe exactly we are somehow working for ourselves in our own little database, or maybe at one point thinking about a institutional repository and where we can store the data, but pretty much every single project, and there we are again with the funding, every single project usually creates its own infrastructure pretty much. And this is something which is redundant. This is something which we shouldn't be doing. And this is why this is so important to standardize. And one of the points is, one of the possibilities is really to go through authorities. And the other part is really about using the infrastructure, the standardize also, and the infrastructure that our institutions offer if we are part of an institution. I hope this answered your question, but I believe that it is somehow interconnected, all of this.
It's very interesting for me that you point out the importance of the funding, and also that the persons involved and getting their also identifiers are a part of the context and a part of the data context. That's quite interesting. But I'm not sure if this is broadly seen already, because I think also in the industry that we are all data, and we are all essential daters. We don't have seen this, or do you have some insight of this from your research, Devin, of this role of the person and the data?
Can you ask the question one more time? I want to make sure I'm getting it.
I drifted a little bit away because I was thinking about the last things we discussed here. So that so from the funding Fanny brought the funding perspective, and also that each person there with the identifier are part of the context and also part of the data and the data structure itself. So that we are a part of the whole game, are also part of the context and part of the data. Is the researchers already aware of this, that they are also part of the data and part of the whole game in the data and in the data standards?
I think they are aware that they know about the data and they are able to provide details about the data, but I don't know if they quite consider themselves being part of the data. I think they think, it's my data. That's what they, or I want to find data that, because I have a research question that I'm trying to answer. But it's just they want the information so that they can move on with their study. But if they are creating the data or producing the data, they just have this sense of ownership. And I don't think they really consider themselves being a part of the data. They consider being the parent of the data.
I think in the humanities, I think there's more an appreciation that the researcher is an important part of the context, because you're always asking, who said that? Why did they say that? It's a lot more. I guess there's a lot more awareness, especially if you're studying intellectual history, where you're studying other people and what they said. There's an awareness that you are just an ongoing part, or part of an ongoing discourse, and your assertions need to be qualified in just the same sort of way. So, and I guess because there's the appreciation that a lot of the material you're dealing with is subjective in its interpretation, there is a more awareness, I think, in the humanities of that. In the sciences, there's still this idea in the back of their minds that there's some sort of objective truth, even though I'm a physicist and know that's not true. And therefore, actually knowing who had that idea or who made it can actually be quite interesting. What else have they published? What's their angle on this particular topic? Is actually a useful piece of contextual information.
Please.
Could I just add to this? I think I fully agree in many ways, but also just coming back to data standards and to the FAIR principles. In many ways, both, I think the sciences, in the sense of like physics and so on, I believe, and also humanities. Well, with what you said, Devin, this ownership over the data is restricting researchers from actually sharing the data, because it's, it could be stolen, right? And in the humanities, yes, there is an awareness of this person said that and that person said that, but because one wants to be part of the ones that are cited, there is also fear of sharing the raw data, the raw metadata, because of this importance of citation and being part of the knowledge community, and again, funding. But so in many ways, this is counterintuitive, because it's so important to share the data. It's so important to make it accessible. But the question remains, how can we do that and at the same time get attribution for it?
That's really a fantastic discussion, a fantastic roundtable. We started with data standards and the importance to find and discover data, and then we came to the context is important, and we are now discussing a lot of context where researcher is doing and how this is structured and how the data will be structured there. So that's really fantastic. And but we are coming to an end. And I like to ask you all for a short question for the future. So what do you think it's important in future that we can improve the data sharing, the data discovery, with helping with standards, or what are the essential things? Just one or two things, what you see it's very important. Devin, I'd like to start with you.
I hope that in the future there can be greater partnerships with researchers and librarians who are working in this area, because I think that there is a lack of awareness and understanding of researchers of the work that librarians are doing in this space, and the ways in which they are already supporting the kinds of things that they want done. So I don't think it's necessarily that the things that they want aren't happening, but they don't know. I mean, there's so many participants that I've had that they said, it never occurred to me to ask a librarian about some of the issues that I'm having with my data. And so I know that we spend a lot of time doing our work and aren't necessarily publicizing what it is that we do, because that is a job too, and we're a finite resource. There's only so many hours in the day. But I hope that in the future there can be more awareness raising, on of the researchers about the work that librarians are already doing, to support some of the things that they say that they want.
Thank you. That's great. So the awareness and the connecting of the people. Neil, what do you think?
Okay, I could pick several things, I guess, but I think we need to work on the citability of things that are not just publications. Because increasingly your scholarly record is only minorly publications, and the data and other online ephemera are actually quite essential parts of the scholarly record. But alongside citation, there also needs to be some idea of credit, both giving credit to the people who create these alternative scholarly outputs, but also the fact that the people who make the decisions understand that these are valid scholarly outputs and these are useful points of impact. And I think until they achieve the same sort of recognition that publications do, it's hard to resource treating them and giving them as much effort in their preparation as publications do.
Yes, thank you. And I think also to credit the work, not only the publication, also the data and all the work what is done before is very essential, and it would really help and would change a lot. So, Fanny, what's your ideas or wishes for the future?
Yes, I totally agree with both of you in so many ways. And I believe I would just say I would start even early. I would start by saying that just like disciplinary standards are what is taught in university in the first few semesters. I believe what is essential is that methodologies of data creation and metadata creation should be part of these first steps into a discipline. It should be mandatory to actually understand what what librarians are doing, what data stewards are doing, and why it is important to talk to them. What are the standards in our field that we need to abide by, so as to be able to continue? And we also that it's important to work collaboratively, to talk to each other, instead of as it is still very much common in the humanities to understand scholarship as something like individual and single-minded. And if we stop acting or seeing it that way, then we can actually get to the point where we can share the data, where we can think about sharing data and metadata, but where we can also understand the standards are just essential to be able to do that. So I would really start at the very beginning, and well, maybe not in high school, but at the university level, in the first few semesters.
Thank you. So also to bring more the idea of sharing, the importance of sharing, and bring the people and educating the people and the benefits and what's really why you should do it. And because we're living in a world where all the connection of the ideas are getting the greater and solve our problems what we are facing, and not keeping stuff to yourself. Thank you very much. It was a fantastic roundtable. I enjoyed it really. It was great. It was a really nice discussion. It goes a little bit in another direction, but it was really nice. And we covered, I think, very essential things for data sharing, and also standards are that people are agreed on it, and bringing the people together. It's the first step to generate new and good standards. Thank you. Thank you very much.